All right, I just hit the record button so we could get started.
Okay.
Yeah. Are you ready to go, Terence?
Yes, ma'am.
Looking
forward to it.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to this webinar we're having today with the Impact Seat. I can see some of the attendees are folks I do know, and then there's a bunch of people who are new, whom I don't know, so it's nice to meet you all. The Impact Seat is sort of an umbrella organization which provides investment in early stage companies, philanthropy committed to entrepreneurship and diversity and inclusion, and advocacy, supporting certain political candidates who also believe in diversity and inclusion and innovation. And then we have this layer of communication sort of on top of it. So part of the mission here is to continue to invest in a diverse range of interesting, innovative companies. I've been investing in for almost 10 years through my investment company called Tethered LLC, and I've got about 60 companies in the portfolio, plus I'm also part of about a dozen funds. Many of those funds are portfolio funds, if folks are familiar with portfolio. And so earlier this year, I brought on Terence Craig. Terence and I have known each other for a couple of years, and he, pitched what he said was a really crazy idea, which was, why doesn't he come in-house? And in many ways, we're sort of like the yin and the yang, because he has great, we both have entrepreneurial experience. He has deep technical experience. And so I thought, well, why not? Because, assisting early stage companies with, their whole technology plan is something that I know that they need. And so that sort of birthed the idea of this as maybe the first of many webinars. We'll see if we don't scare you too much, Sarah, with all our questions. But anyway, so why don't I turn it over to you, Terence, introduce yourself to folks, and then we'll jump right in.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. Really appreciate you attending today, and hopefully you'll get some value out of it. As Barbara said, I am the Director of Entrepreneurship at Impact Seat. My job is to help entrepreneurs in any way that I can, and if you've got a interesting business and you're a diverse company, we certainly would love to talk to you. With that, let's just hop in.
And we do have a poll, so let me know when we should pop up the poll. Should we do that now?
Let's pop up the poll before we go.
All right. I'm going to do a little, I'm going to launch a poll because a big part about what we will always want to do is sort of demystify language and terminology. So, anyway, so we have these questions about some of the terminology, which is right on this page here for Scrum and Agile. And so we've got a bunch of people responding. And it looks like we have a nice mix of people who are very familiar. And then, oh, good, at least somebody got my little joke about, was this rugby? Because I remember I was like, Scrum, what are we doing? So anyway, all right, so we've got a nice mix of people. And I do know that there are some ringers on here, some pretty technical people who have actually attended, who are in here. So, all right, that's good to know.
Okay, well, that'll keep me honest, at least.
And I'm going to share the results. So there you go. So that's our answer. Half
okay.
of people are pretty familiar. So that's really good.
Excellent.
All
Excellent.
right.
And obviously, this is a big topic, so we're going to skim over the top, and I'm hoping that we can get into depth with questions. So if you walk away with anything from this topic, it's that it should be that you should be using Scrum and Agile, and that you should get very, very good at development operations. Just quick definition, since we've got some familiarity. Agile is an iterative development process that is very popular in the software community, but can be used elsewhere. Scrum is a software-specific methodology that is very popular that uses Agile to develop software projects. The Agile primarily works by taking small chunks of large projects, iterating on them, and using quality metrics to determine how close you get. So unit testing and test coverage are automated ways to determine the quality of your software at the developer level. Sprints, Scrum Master is basically a project manager. Sprint is just a 2-week sprint to get something done so you can measure how you're doing. Development operations is quite simply the automation of the deployment of software. Continuous integration is about bringing software together into a cohesive unit as it will be shipped and testing it. Continuous deployment is about taking that unit, if it passes, and deploying it almost automatically. Generally, there's a manual step in there. Shipping criteria is just a really simple term. If you're going to get away from these arbitrary release dates and move to an agile methodology, you need to decide when you're done. And shipping criteria basically says we will ship this feature when this is true. Integration test is just an automated test to make sure the software does what you expect. Okay, that's enough for terminologies. Let's dive in. So here's the bad news. Software projects fail at probably about 49% underperform in some way or other. I won't bother to read the slide, but what I will say is if for this audience, where we're building products for sale or we're building platforms for things like e-commerce platforms, the failure rates are much higher because these are typically much more complex than the standard IT project you'll see at a Conoco, for example. Next slide, please. Yes, you will be able to get the slides. I'm sorry, Barbara, I was supposed to let you answer that question.
That's fine.
So in terms of, one of the things that I like to point out to people, particularly non-technical founders, is don't be confused by the term software engineering. Civil engineering, they can tell you, I'm going to build a bridge and I'm going to deliver it in X amount of time. And within about 10% of time, it will be delivered. Software engineering is not like that. And one of the things to understand, is it's because of the complexity of modern software architects. Particularly if you look at applications developed for the cloud, these are things that rival the complexity of the early Apollo moonshots. And this idea that we can predict something of that complexity down to the day or even the week is just ridiculous, maybe the quarter. All of the things that have been done recently in software engineering that has improved productivity has been about modernizing and automating the collaborative art form and process. Next slide, please. So I always find it interesting and sort of tragic. I do a lot of consulting where I am trying to fix a broken engineering process and I'm dealing with a CEO and a CTO that have decided that each other are idiots. And what really is happening is there is just a completely different worldview about what's going on. So I thought I'd give both of the worldviews because I've been a founder and a CEO and I've also been an engineer. So I think I have a fair view of both perspectives. Engineers believe,
and it's also like which side of the I think for the folks who are watching now, like which side are you on? Like, are you more technical or are you more with the non-technical?
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So, engineers by and large, and obviously I'm going to draw some gross stereotypes, but these are in general true, that writing code is better than buying code. There's a not invented here bias that non-technical founders need to fight all of the time because it will hurt your productivity and it raises your risk. You should never let engineers write code if there's a service available or a good open source project. If they want to do that, make them justify it and make them do it in writing. Engineers also believe that they can write bug-free code. History has shown that no, that's not true. And one of the things that will happen is that things like automating quality metrics, et cetera, or even recommendations on hiring QA, engineering will always, well, we can wait. No, you can't. And in fact, if you want a quality software project, you need to start day one thinking about how you're going to do that. They're fortune tellers. As I said, these are incredibly complex projects. Modern software is an incredibly complex business, often involving multiple vendors across multiple clouds, et cetera, et cetera. And nobody can schedule this, so it's just ridiculous. And when people give you hard dates, just nod your head and move on and understand that they don't know what they're talking about. This is one that I think is really interesting for CEOs who are not technical. You go to your engineer on a Friday Will we be able to ship? Yes. And what the engineer is thinking is that weekends are essentially infinite. And it sounds funny, but it's true. And as an engineer, I used to believe it too. So really, just take schedules into account. Never believe I will get it done in 48 hours. It's just not going to happen. And then finally, once again, engineers tend to avoid the tedious: development operations, security, and quality. And oftentimes, unfortunately, the MVP mantra is used to say, we can ignore security. What people don't mention is it can take a year to retrofit security back in. And usually you end up having to write everything. So be very careful about what the minimum MVP is. Non-technical founders tend to believe things like tech can be bug-free. You're never going to have bug-free software. Pick a shipping criteria, say, this is the level of bugs that I'm willing to accept. And when you get there, ship it. And it just has to be acceptable. Remember, the perfect is the enemy of good. Because software go ahead.
Oh, I was going to interrupt. We do have a question which goes back to the first point about,
Sure.
How you shouldn't be writing code if you don't have to. And so the question is, if you start off using services instead of building tools in-house, do you ever recommend building in-house once you reach significant growth to either build defensibility or reduce reliability or on another company? Because sometimes you're hamstrung sometimes by the tools you pick.
Yeah. So generally what I recommend is when you're starting out, pick a tool set, for example, a cloud vendor. All of the cloud vendors offer things like database services, security services, distributed denial and service. Use all of them because that'll get your product to market faster. Then once you have some scale, you have a couple of decisions to make. Do you lower your risk by spreading your software across multiple vendors? So you have the ability to support MySQL on Azure and SQL Server on AWS or something weird like that, to give yourself the flexibility. The other thing that I always look at to do this is, what are my cost structure? Really, the only reason to take an architectural risk is there's some strategic imperative. You're worried about the vendor changing your relationships in some way or becoming a competitor, or the cost structure is just gone out of whack and now build versus buy makes some sense. So that would be my quick take. So let's see. So one of the things that non-technical founders do that can be amazingly disruptive to engineering teams is there's an assumption that because software is a virtual artifact, that small changes have small schedule impacts. And in point of fact, small changes break engineering momentum, which is incredibly bad. One of the benefits of Agile is you will be able to interrupt engineering on a regular schedule, probably every 2 weeks. And this is the point you introduce change. Introducing change in the middle of the cycle just means nothing gets done. And there's also this idea that when engineering tells you quality, security, and performance are taken care of, to take it as is. No. As in every organization, if you're going to check your sales guy when he says the pipeline is strong, you need to check your engineering organization when they say things are going to ship in a couple of weeks, or that the software has been tested for security. Next slide, please. So here's some general thoughts on what, by definition, has to be very flexible. It depends on what your network is like and how much money you have. But in general, I think that for companies starting out, one of the things that happens is too often they don't get a real product manager. The CEO tries to fill that role and doesn't have the chops to be a PM and specify things correctly. The other problem is they hire an engineer that doesn't have architectural experience, who's able to throw a product together, but not one that you can scale with, and you end up throwing it all away. So my recommendation is that people hire a architectural level as their first software hire. And if the CEO is not really a brilliant PM, get at least a part-time PM to flesh out that initial VP and that initial architecture stack. Once the architecture stack is set up, then you can hire additional engineers. And this is the point I'd really recommend hiring a QA person, and if you can afford it, a project manager or scrum master. If you get very lucky, your product manager can also be your scrum master, but the people who can do both jobs are pretty slim on the ground. Moving on
Can
to...
you elaborate? Can you elaborate the difference between the two?
So a product
Like,
manager...
what's the skill set that differentiates them?
So a product manager traditionally is responsible for defining the product and for capturing information from the field, from the customers, to refine the product. That's the PM. The project manager is responsible for making trains run on time. Okay, we have a scrum meeting. We're going to have this feature to show. Bam, bam, bam. Our bug rate is X. Next scrum meeting will be here. That make sense?
Yeah, it does to me. Folks put in the chat if you don't agree, but yeah.
Okay. And then the sort of the post MVP stage is when you really need to start thinking about a VP of engineering or a CTO. Do not make the classic mistakes of having two. A lot of times people will hire a early software engineer who's really not a management guy, and then they have to bring in a management person, excuse the gendered pronouns, I'm working on it. Bring in some management folks. And the tendency is to take the early engineer and make him the CTO to preserve his ego. And what that leads to is 2 years of fighting before you end up firing the early engineer. So just don't do it. Next slide, please. So if I was going to leave you with 5 thoughts, which is all Barbara would allow me, I had like 20. The first one is hire experienced engineers. Really, there is no excuse to hire somebody you have to train. Your first engineer should be very experienced, should have architectural experience. Your second engineer can be less experienced, but he should still have gone through a couple of product release cycles. As soon as possible, have an independent QA team reporting to the CEO or product manager. They tend to end up in engineering organizations, and the conflict of interest, I think, should be pretty clear to everybody. And even the best, meaning engineering manager, can short quality when he's got other things to do. So quality should be a separate process. Let go of ship fix dates. Software is too complex to predict, particularly for an early stage company. So focus on getting a feature out, feature by feature, not version deployment. Really, if you want a good example of doing this really well, Google's rollout of Gmail and their subsequent adding of features and the whole beta process they have is a great example of agile software development. At minimum, meet every 2 weeks for a software presentation and to get metrics on bug rates, regression rates, test coverage, all of the things about a software organization. One of the key mistakes that professional software organizations make is that they let software run by itself and assume everything will take care of itself. Just like a sales organization, engineering organizations need to be monitored and they need to get feedback. Number 5 is a little interesting. There is a relatively new methodology called test-driven development that is very popular. If you haven't started your product, it is worth thinking about it if you can find engineers who are familiar with TDD. It is a much more quality-driven, efficient way to develop software, but it does require some experience to be good at it. Scrum, you should be doing 2-week sprints the minute you have an engineer in the building. Get your engineering organization used to 2 things: reporting their progress on a regular basis and deploying a product to be tested on a regular basis. If you can do that, the rest will sort of fall in line. Next slide, please. All right, so more than anything, and it's very interesting, technology goes through these fads where we'll go for the hero programmer model or we'll go for the completely collaborative model. At the end of the day, we always come back to this completely collaborative model because it's the only one that works. If you have an engineer on your team who is completely irreplaceable, you have done a horrible job as a manager. Think about what happens when that engineer gets run over by a truck. So build a team, make it a team sport, make sure that people share skills, and that way your organization can survive the inevitable politics quitting or Google going, wow, what a great engineer. Here's $400,000, which happens a lot, by the way. I've already gone over the VP and CTO thing, so I'll skip that. Consider innovative compensation plans. So say you don't have enough money to compete with Google, which makes you like 95% of the companies on the planet. Think about things like offering a commission on sales of product, which can add up to quite a bit of money. But consider innovative compensations, and don't think that engineers are completely focused on technology and they don't care about the money they make. They care very much about how management cares about what money they make, if that makes sense. And finally, remember the 10X rule. It has been common knowledge for years that about 1/10 of engineers are 10 times as productive as the rest. If you can find them, and the only way you will know is by asking people who've worked with them before by reference, they're worth paying for, because they really are 10X. And with that, I think I'll leave it open for questions.
Great. I'm going to stop the share to make it a little easier for us to see the chat, and if people want to put anything in the Q&A feature as well. We have one. Yeah, could you talk a little bit about that sort of 10X rule? Because I think it's not necessarily as commonly understood as what you're saying.
So the 10X rule is, there have been studies going back to the IBM 360 days of the fact that if you look at any average software team, particularly a large one, about 10% of them will be 10 times as productive as everybody else. And the trick is to find these engineers. Nobody's quite clear why it occurs, but most people believe it's an innate ability to process the sort of problems that computer science offers. But what is clear, they do exist. If you can find them, they're well worth capturing. I see a question from Reva, who's got one of my 10X engineers working for her, so she can probably testify to the attributes.
Because I know not everybody can see the question. So Reva's asking, can you talk more about the experience level of your first product can you talk more about the experience level your first product manager should have? Years of experience, industry, education, demonstrable success, et cetera, that you'd look for. And how much do they cost? That's what everyone wants to know.
How much do they cost? Well, the good news is, I'll start with that. The good news is PMs tend to be cheaper, and in down economies, they tend to be widely available. It's one of the positions that gets cut really quickly and really badly in down economic times. In terms of what the number would be, raw startup, pre-funding, I'd be looking somewhere in the 60-80 range for somebody who's got real experience. Post startup, max probably 120, and varying equity based on experience. And I'm talking post seed funding, not post Series A. Things get weird at that point. In terms of experience, I tend to think of PMs the way I do think about engineers. What I like to see is multiple release cycles. So ideally, I would want somebody who had been through at least four release cycles. And at a big company, that's probably 4 years. At a smaller company, you could see that done in 1.5 years easily. In terms of industry experience, it depends on what you do. Ideally, you want somebody who's familiar with industry. So if you're doing something in oil and gas, it'd be great to grab somebody out of Shell if you can find them. But if not, what you're looking for is somebody who's done PM and is smart and flexible enough to go figure it out. Usually, like I said, one of the PM, you hear a lot of people talk about compatibility on teams. The PM slot is the one slot I think it's very important. If the CEO is the expert on the particular domain or business you're entering in, the CEO has to get along very well with the product manager, because that relationship can get really weird quickly if they don't get along. Because at this stage, in my view, a PM is basically there to make sure that the CEO can do all of the other things that are required to get the company going. Did I answer most of the questions?
I think that was good. And then we have a question from Angela. What do you think about hiring a software development company where they have a whole team dedicated to the development of your MVP?
So I think there are a couple of issues that I have with that. First of all, one, there's a financing risk because investors tend to not like that because your IP is at the whim of a third party, and that if you're a software company, your IP is your whole value, your IP and your engineers. So the first thing is it has a negative impact on funding, fundraising. The second thing is it's high risk because you're not training anybody in-house, even if you own the IP and you get the source code. If you haven't trained, if you don't have somebody who's used that source code and trained it in any product of reasonable complexity, you're essentially going to be starting from scratch. And so if you're going to do that, my recommendation is you have a key person, you have a key technical person in-house, and then they work with the team. Ideally, you have your architect in-house, so he architects the system, and you have the third-party development team actually do the implementation. That way, you have control over the key resource, and you have somebody who can take up development if the companies flake out. Just a unsolicited, but a piece of advice: if you're going to hire a third-party development company, be very, very careful in Eastern Europe and make sure you explore IP laws. Because in many Eastern European countries, I'm not a lawyer, but this used to be true. If you start a project and you decide in the middle to quit, you can take all of the IP with you. And so obviously that is a very dangerous thing for a software company. So make sure you understand the IP laws of the country that your third-party developer is from.
There's a question in the Q&A, which I don't quite understand. How much for 2 weeks?
That one.
You got it? Okay.
Oh, actually, I think we're looking at a different question. I saw the no code question. Which one were you looking at?
Oh, I'm looking at in the Q&A. There's a question saying, how much for a 2-week sprint milestone for engineer? I think you need to, the person, can you elaborate on that? Why don't you answer the question that's in the chat, we have the question: what do you think about using no code or low code tools as a non-technical founder to create an MVP and reach the milestones needed to raise the funding that will enable you to hire an engineer?
So I think using no code tools to develop an MVP is a great idea, because initially when MVPs were first being talked about, the idea was to develop something to throw it away. But when people figured out how much that cost, MVPs started evolving into products. So I think no code keeps you honest and really focuses on the design of the product. I think that's a great thing. In terms of will it be enough to, and we're actually at this point looking at a couple of companies that have done this. And the question that I'm asking as a technologist is, what is the risk profile to go from no code to production? Because you've supposedly shown me through your MVP acceptance that there's a product market fit that's interesting. Now I have to understand, are you part of that 49% that's going to fail in that development? So that's the risk. So how do you convince me as an investor you can do development since you haven't done development yet with no code?
Yeah. Okay, and I think that the question that was in the Q&A is really just, again, about like, what are some ranges of salaries for your sort of first engineer hire?
It's all over the place. I would definitely consider hiring somebody out of, potentially India or Mexico, but as an employee, not as part of a firm, because it'll be much cheaper. It depends. Like most things, it depends. It's really a function of how interesting your project is and what the current economic environment is. So, for example, an AI guy, a true baked in the wool AI person that could get hired at Google is worth somewhere between $260,000 to $360,000 a year. And to get an AI guy to work on your project, you're obviously not going to pay him
Or
that.
girl.
So,
we're going to work on that gendered language, folks. Just know that.
guilty. My one defense is I'm from the East Coast. I don't consider it a gendered pronoun, but guilty. So you're not going to get that AI person. What you will get, what you can usually get is you can get somebody who's done a couple of cycles. Now I feel bad. So
we have
in
people
general, you can
agreeing with me in the chat. Anyways,
so in general, you can get an early engineer. Oh man, everybody's hopping in there. I earned it. Okay. So in general, what you will find is that you can usually get an engineer somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 120,000 for sure. If you have a project that appeals to them, or you caught somebody on a good day, you can get it down, to 25. And I know some people who are really senior and have made some money who will go in with no comp at all other than equity. So it really depends on how compelling your project is and how wide your Rolodex is.
And how would you go about that? If you're a non-technical founder, what is the best way to sort of start socializing, that you're looking to hire and you're looking for people to send you referrals if you don't have a connection to the impact seat with all of our amazing network of people? But so what would you do?
So the two places I like to look for startup engineering talent are Stack Overflow and Angels List. Both of them have a large amount of traffic from high quality engineers that are looking to get involved in startups. In fact, there's even a section on Angels List, or there was, I haven't been there in about a year, but there used to be a section for non-technical founders to look for technical founders, co-founders. So both of those sites. In terms of hiring, I like Stack Overflow a little better, just because you can. The thing about Stack Overflow that's interesting, so for those of you who are not familiar with it, Stack Overflow is a developer's website for questions to answer. It actually predates Core, very Core-like, but specifically for software development. And as you answer questions, you get a score, a Stack Overflow score. And since I believe that software is primarily a communication job as opposed to just a technology job, you get to see how people communicate very well on Stack Overflow. And in general, if you are a person that reads Stack Overflow regularly, you are a higher quality software engineer.
I just popped in the chat. We put a blog post up today with a glossary of some additional technical terms. Because when I first saw the presentation for Terence, I was just like, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? So I figure let's just put it in a glossary. And we'll have this recording too. We can, I'll post it up on the website. Another question here. Based on your experience, what's the most common way founders finance themselves while building their MVP?
It's all over the map, and once again it depends on your success on finding that first engineering hire, and a lot of that's based on luck. But it really is that your access to the talent that's going to determine that. And if you have access or can find access to talent, you can do it for nearly for free. So flipping from the doom and gloom of finding engineers' salaries, one of the things that everybody on this call should be happy about is the cloud has given us this huge infrastructure to very cheaply do MVPs. And without that, most of the startups today wouldn't exist. So It really is, and one of the things that's kind of interesting is how aggressive Microsoft and Google in particular are about helping entrepreneurs get on their platforms. So it may or may not work, but I would call up Microsoft and say, hey, I'm the startup. I need an engineer so I can use your platform, and see what they come up with. I've known people who've done that successfully, particularly with Google.
I would say just in general, the question too, it's also just more broadly about how do you, bootstrap to a point that you've made something that's interesting. And, there are lots of companies that are, they get revenue from prospective clients, because you're solving a problem. If you're focused on being the solution to a very difficult problem, companies may be willing just to, pay for the consulting on that problem, because it's something that they can't solve themselves, or they're not solving for themselves. So I've seen that quite a bit, and as we all know, there's no shame in your company being your side hustle for, while you're doing something completely different. I actually think that is completely underestimated.
Yeah.
The power of having something as a side hustle while you have another job, even though you may be really excited about working on it,
Mm-hmm.
there are bills to pay.
And the other thing about you can often find good engineers are very passionate about what they do. So I would not give up early on finding somebody particularly if they're working another job, to come in and hop in for equity. It happens a lot. So I wouldn't give up on it, but I would certainly start building that Rolodex and those relationships now.
Yeah, particularly, I think, and it also goes to what you were saying, was that, a good engineer, you're not writing all the new code. You're sort of putting a bunch of stuff together, stuff that's already been written.
Yeah. I'll tell you another interesting place to look for engineers is the open source community. So in particular, if there's a product that's similar, an open source project that's similar, become part of that community and start communicate with the so-called committers, the people who actually write the code that forms the project. And you can often find people there that are very interested in becoming part of a startup.
One thing which I know you sort of touched on, but I just wanted to sort of underscore, was calling somebody a CTO who really isn't a CTO is not a good idea for anyone. And I think and in particular, we had a conversation one time about the signal it sends out into the marketplace about what you're really looking for. Because if at the end of the day, maybe you're not a technical product, maybe you're a tech-enabled service or something like that, a CTO title is just too heavy of a lift. Like, it's not what you're really looking for. And so, to be really honest, that you're really looking for a VP of engineering, you get a very different group of people applying.
Yeah. And CTOs are primarily, traditionally CTOs were supposed to be forward-looking people who had a small research team that were working on VNext. And the VP of engineering is supposed to ship things that produce revenue. And startups don't need to look for VNext. They need to produce revenue.
Mm-hmm. Question here is, what types of software tasks are a good way to test out skill sets? For example, architect understanding, agile, product management skills, et cetera, you mentioned for an early engineer lead hire.
You can't really test for architectural level of competence. You just have to get references and look at the person's portfolio. There really isn't a good way, particularly if you're not technical, to dig into somebody's architectural chops. But once again, references in particular are really important. One of the good ways, there are a lot of people that think they're architects, which is one of the interesting things. Most of them can't code even simple programming tests. So one of the things that I highly encourage every startup to do is to have a simple programming test. Not something that's particularly hard, but something like, I want you to write a queue that is thread safe, which is not difficult. if you're a programmer. And then they write it, either they write it or even if they do write it, when they show up, one of your technical advisors, because if you're not technical, you will need one, needs to ask them why they chose to implement it the way they did. And that, quite frankly, will knock out 90% of the incompetent folks. People who are incompetent in this industry tend to be wildly incompetent. It's actually
They
very interesting.
fail big. They fail big. Actually, and that brings up a good point about having technical and one or more technical advisors on your journey. You know, what are some of ideas about that as well, like recruiting them, or what kind of person should you be looking for as well as an advisor?
Well, so if you want a technical advisor, basically I would personally be looking for somebody who is a VP level skill. So they have both management, they understand how to grow an engineering organization. I think that is going to be one of the critical things that people will need advice on. Secondly, there are two types of engineering managers. They're very technical engineering managers, and there are sort of the strategic, let's move around 100 people to Guam to save some money. You definitely need a very technical engineering manager, somebody who is still involved in the code in some way, but also has the broader insight into the broader business. And those are the sort of people I'd look for. And by the way, they don't necessarily have to be a VP if you're talking about large public companies. If you look at the span of control that somebody at Salesforce has as a senior engineering manager, it is pretty extensive. And so those are great people to associate with. And they're also easy to find. And typically, particularly at the senior manager level and below, they don't get asked a lot to be advisors. So it's a nice ego stroke for them, and they have, in many ways, more relevant experience than a VP at Salesforce would have for your situation.
Cool. Any other questions? Final questions from folks? So as I mentioned, check out the glossary, and we have one question. Good. Transitioning from MVP to scaling, what should we look for? How long do you have? No, that's my question. Yeah.
What do you look like? In what context?
Well, what are the big things? Like, we've made an MVP. How's it going to change when we scale this up?
So the first thing you have to do is you have to bring in more engineers, assuming that the product is relatively complex, to bring it up. Then you have to start to really fully automate your deployment processes. So can I deliver my product and or products reliably on time? And if you're delivering a mobile app, for example, that's incredibly complex because you have approval processes and timing, et cetera. So really it's easier to talk about the things that people screw up when going to scale. So the first thing that people do is they underestimate the need for security. And the first thing you will find is that they've rolled their own security as opposed to using a security service. And they'll send the thing out there without doing a penetration test. And a penetration test is you hire a third party to break into the thing. And then they're shocked when they're brought down by denial of service, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that many people don't understand is often competitors hire people to crash other people's systems. It happens all of the time. And if you don't deal with denial of service attacks, if you don't deal with security issues, you're going to come down. So that's the first and most obvious thing. And it's one that engineers tend to avoid or minimize because most engineers don't understand security, period. It's a very specialized part of software engineering. Other things that people don't do, they don't test for scale. So I've been running on Azure. I've had about 1,000 concurrent users a day. Things are great. I get a nice, this actually happened to me. I get Microsoft as a partner, published our website on their homepage. All of a sudden, I had 10,000 concurrents. Had we tested for it? No. Did the system crash? Absolutely. And right. So always look at what you expect in terms of usage. And my recommendation is multiply that times 10 and test the system under that load. Because one of the worst things that can happen for you as a startup is to get positive press, people trying the system, and it fails under load. Also something that happens under the time. Let's see, what's the other big one is not using defensive coding. And this is a little technical, but so basically, if you think about the number of requests coming in and processing a request, you can't process all the requests, so you stick them in a queue. If the queue overflows, then you have all sorts of problems. If you don't manage that process, how do I deal with these requests coming in very quickly? You leave yourself open to a whole host of problems. And that it's part of performance, but it's also about capacity planning. So really, those are the big things that people fail at. And note that all of them can be tested, which is the tragedy. People just don't know.
Yeah. Great. Terence, you want to, let's see, do you have any final, wait, every time I try to wrap up some of the other questions, so this will be the last one. What about having technical investors who can provide some guidance? What would the drawbacks be with that?
Since I am one, none. Go after the technical investors. They're wonderful people.
Yeah, right. Well, and Kathy, who asked the question, she herself is also a technical person too. I think that how could it be bad? I mean, you might have situations where would it be that they're in a particular industry that's just very different than the one you're in? I don't know, maybe. But then that tends to be more customer-facing issue.
There is one issue that I've seen with technical advisors that shows up occasionally. Often a technical advisor has been out of the game for 10, 15 years. They're retired, they've made money somewhere else.
That's true of like a lot of angel investors. They're very out of the game. Yeah.
Right. And and often if you're a non-technical founder, when a guy who co-founded this great company 10 years ago says, use this technology, you go, okay. And point of fact, he's 15 years out of date. And so if you're going to take technical advice from somebody, make sure you're taking technical advice from somebody who's actually technically correct.
Yeah. All right, great. So thanks everybody for coming. I'll send out the recording should you want to share this. I would love for you to share this with people you care about. Send it to an enemy as well, maybe. We just broaden our network of people. So thanks very much. As mentioned, we have a glossary on the website, and then we'll put some other stuff up there. And if there are other topics that you'd like, please let us know.
And just one thing, my Twitter's out there. If I can help, send me a tweet. I'll try and help out.
Great. And we'll send the slides. And that has both of our Twitter handles.
And I will get better at not using Guy. My apologies to everybody on the call.
All right.